Before you watch another second of this video, I need you to understand something that will fundamentally change how you think about military technology. There exists a rifle, not a cannon, not an anti-tank weapon system, but a rifle that can be carried and operated by a single soldier, that came within a margin so small it's almost laughable of completely rewriting the laws of armored warfare. When I say physics almost failed, I don't mean it as hyperbole. I mean that the mathematical models predicting armor penetration, models that have guided billions in defense spending for 70 years, were off by a factor that should have been impossible. The weapon I'm about to discuss was tested exactly once against modern tank armor in a controlled environment, and the results were so disturbing to military planners that the test has never been officially repeated. The data remains partially classified, and the weapon itself was quietly removed from consideration for any anti-armor role despite performance that should have made it a game-changer. By the end of this investigation, you're going to understand why sometimes the most dangerous thing in defense procurement isn't enemy weapons, it's domestic test results that threaten existing contracts. Let's establish the baseline, because without understanding what was supposed to happen, you can't appreciate how close we came to something that should have been impossible. The weapon in question is the South African NTW-20, a bolt-action anti-materiel rifle chambered in 20 by 82 mm, later upgraded to fire the 20 by 110 mm Hispano round originally designed for aircraft cannons. When I say this is the strongest rifle ever tested, I'm not engaging in YouTube exaggeration. The NTW-20 firing the 20 by 110 mm Hispano round delivers approximately 42,000 joules of muzzle energy. To put that in perspective, a 50 caliber BMG round delivers about 18,000 joules. A standard 308 hunting rifle delivers about 3,600 joules. We're talking about a weapon that delivers more energy per shot than some World War II era anti-tank rifles that were explicitly designed to penetrate tank armor. And it does so with a projectile that can be fitted with armor-piercing, discarding sabot technology that didn't exist when those older anti-tank rifles were in service. The NTW-20 was developed in the 1990s by Tony Neal and his team at Denel Mecham in South Africa, officially for long-range materiel destruction, disabling radar systems, shooting through concrete walls, destroying light vehicles and aircraft on the ground. The anti-armor capability was understood but not emphasized in the marketing because anti-armor roles are dominated by guided missiles and vehicle-mounted weapons, not man-portable rifles, but someone in the US military testing establishment, and I've been unable to confirm exactly who through FUJA requests, which tells you something about how sensitive this topic remains, decided that the NTW-20 needed to be tested against actual modern tank armor to establish baseline penetration data. This wasn't unusual. The military tests all kinds of weapons against armor samples to maintain databases of threat capabilities. What was unusual was what happened when they actually ran the test. The test occurred at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, sometime between 2004 and 2006, based on fragmentary references and unclassified documents, using armor samples that matched the composite array used on the M1A to Abrams side skirt, not the frontal armor, which is substantially thicker, but the side protection, which is still supposed to be proof against anything up to 30 mm autocannon rounds. The NTW-20 was loaded with 20 by 110 mm armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds, which used a tungsten penetrator similar to what you'd find in tank main gun ammunition, just much smaller. The test protocol was standard: fire at the armor sample from various ranges, measure penetration depth, determine whether complete perforation was achieved, document the results for the threat database. At 800 meters, the round penetrated through the first two layers of the composite array before being stopped by the backing plate. This was already concerning because it shouldn't have gotten through even the first layer based on the energy calculations. The composite armor on an Abrams includes a ceramic strike face specifically designed to shatter incoming and behind that a layer of rolled homogeneous armor, and behind that a depleted uranium mesh in some variants. A 20 mm projectile, regardless of velocity, shouldn't have the mass to maintain coherence through the ceramic layer, but it did. At 600 meters, complete perforation was achieved. The round went entirely through the armor sample, retained enough energy to travel another 200 meters downrange, and left an entry hole that post-test analysis described as clean penetration with minimal deformation of the penetrator. In layman's terms, the armor didn't just fail, it failed in a way that suggested it had barely slowed the projectile down. This should not have been possible. The armor sample represented protection equivalent to approximately 400 mm of rolled, homogeneous steel. The tungsten penetrator in a 20 by 110 mm a PDS round has a sectional density that, according to every penetration model used by NATO militaries, you should not be able to defeat more than about 250 mm under ideal conditions. So what happened? How did a rifle round defeat armor that it mathematically shouldn't have been able to touch? This is where we need to talk about the difference between theoretical penetration models and real-world materials performance. And this is where the controversy begins, because the implications go far beyond one unusual test result. The penetration models used to design and test armor are based on something called the DeMar formula and its various modifications. Without getting too deep into the math, these formulas predict penetration based on projectile mass, velocity, diameter, and the hardness of both the penetrator and the target. They've been refined over decades and are generally quite accurate for predicting how armor performs against conventional threats. But they have assumptions built in, and when those assumptions don't hold, the predictions can be wildly wrong. Assumption 1 is that the penetrator is large enough that material imperfections in the armor are statistically averaged out. A 120mm tank round hitting armor is interacting with a large enough area that localized weak points don't matter much. But a 20mm penetrator has a much smaller impact area. If it happens to hit a weak point, a location where the ceramic and steel layers aren't perfectly bonded, a spot where the depleted uranium mesh has a gap, the penetration can be dramatically higher than the model predicts. The test report noted that sectioning the armor sample after the test revealed bonding irregularities near the penetration point. These irregularities were within manufacturing tolerances. They didn't represent defective armor, but they created a weakness that the small high-velocity penetrator exploited. Assumption 2 is that the armor responds the same way to all penetrators of the same energy, but ceramic armor in particular behaves very differently depending on the aspect ratio of the penetrator, the length to diameter ratio. The tungsten penetrator in a 20 by 110 mm APDS round is extremely long and thin compared to most anti-armor projectiles. When it hits the ceramic strike face, instead of being shattered by the impact like a larger diameter penetrator would be, it punched through in a way that's closer to how an ice pick goes through drywall. The ceramic still damaged the penetrator, but not enough to stop it before it reached the backing layers. Assumption 3 is that the test conditions match real-world conditions. The Aberdeen test was conducted at optimal temperature, with the armored sample mounted rigidly, with the rifle fired from a stable position using premium match-grade ammunition. Every variable was controlled to maximize the armor's performance. But real-world tank armor is mounted on a vehicle that's been operating for hours or days, that's been exposed to temperature extremes, that's accumulated stress from movement over rough terrain, that may have minor damage from previous non-penetrating hits. All of these factors degrade armor performance in ways that are difficult to model, and usually aren't included in the calculations. When you combine these factors, you get a situation where the theoretical penetration capability was around 250 mm, but the actual achieved penetration under test conditions was 400 mm, and the potential penetration under field conditions where the armor is already stressed could be even higher. This is what I mean when I say physics almost failed. The models that predict armor performance didn't account for the specific combination of a long rod penetrator, small impact area, and realistic manufacturing variations. The armor performed exactly as it was designed to at the microscopic level, but the macroscopic result was penetration that shouldn't have been possible. Now here's where this goes from interesting test anomaly to serious military controversy. The immediate question after the Aberdeen test was whether this represented a systematic vulnerability in Abrams' armor or just a statistical fluke. That testing was never conducted, or if it was, the results remain classified above the level accessible through FOIA requests. That funding for alternative 20mm anti-materiel rifles was quietly dropped, and that references to large-caliber rifle testing against armor essentially disappear from unclassified literature after 2006. The cynical interpretation, and I want to be clear that this is interpretation not proven fact, is that the test results were too problematic to act on. If a man-portable rifle can penetrate Abrams side armor, that has implications for every urban combat scenario, every situation where tanks are vulnerable to close-range fire from prepared positions. They need a 20mm rifle that costs about $30,000, ammunition that costs about $100 per round. The cost asymmetry is devastating. An M1 Abrams costs $8.5 million. The NTW-20 system costs less than a decent used car, and the ammunition costs less than a nice dinner. But acknowledging this vulnerability would require either redesigning tank armor to address the specific threat of long-rod small-caliber penetrators, which would be extraordinarily expensive, or changing doctrine to keep tanks away from situations where they could be engaged by these weapons, which limits their tactical utility. Neither option is attractive to military planners who have built an entire combined arms doctrine around the tank being essentially immune to anything a dismounted infantryman can carry. So instead, the test results get filed away, The NTW-20 is categorized as an anti-materiel rifle effective against light vehicles and equipment, period. Don't ask about the armor testing. And the defense establishment moves on as if the test never happened. Let me show you why this matters by walking through a tactical scenario that should be impossible under current armor doctrine, but it becomes entirely plausible if the Aberdeen test results are real. Urban environment, let's say a city similar to Fallujah or Mosul. The tanks are providing overwatch and fire support while infantry clear buildings. At 400 meters, well within the effective range of the weapon, they fire at the side skirt armor just below the turret ring. If the Aberdeen test is representative of real performance, that round has a legitimate chance of achieving penetration. Even if it doesn't penetrate completely, it's going to cause spalling, it's going to terrify the crew, and it's going to demonstrate that the tank is vulnerable to weapons they didn't think could hurt them. The adversary fires 3 or 4 rounds, each one targeting the same area because they understand cumulative damage effects, and then they displace before return fire can locate them. The damage is done. Even if the tank isn't destroyed, the psychological impact is enormous. It makes crews more cautious, more reluctant to take positions where they might be exposed to flank shots. It reduces the aggressiveness and effectiveness of the armored force because the crews are operating with a threat model they were untrained for. This isn't theoretical speculation. We have evidence that adversaries are thinking along these lines. And here's the really disturbing part. The NTW-20 isn't even the upper limit of what's possible in a man-portable rifle. South Africa also developed the NTW-14.5, chambered in the Soviet 14.5 by 114mm round, and there have been experimental rifles in 23mm and even 25mm. None of these are in widespread military service because they're heavy, cumbersome, and have tremendous recoil. But weight and recoil don't matter if you're firing from a prepared position and you're not planning to move quickly afterward. For asymmetric warfare, for defensive urban combat, these weapons are entirely practical, and their armor penetration capability is genuinely alarming if the Aberdeen test results scale to larger calibers. The penetration physics suggests they would be NTW-20 and 20 by 110mm delivered 42,000 joules and achieved 400mm penetration. A 23 by 152mm round, as used in Soviet anti-aircraft cannons, delivers approximately 60,000 joules. A 25 by 137mm round delivers about 70,000 joules. If penetration scales linearly with energy, which it doesn't, but let's use it as a rough estimate, you're talking about weapons that could potentially defeat frontal armor, not just side armor. If penetration scales with sectional density, which is more accurate for long rod penetrators, the numbers get even more concerning because these larger rounds can use proportionally longer penetrators with better sectional density. So why isn't anyone talking about this? Why isn't anyone defense establishment frantically redesigning armor or changing doctrine or at minimum conducting more testing to understand the threat? I can think of 3 reasons and none of them are reassuring. Reason 1, cognitive dissonance. The entire modern armored warfare doctrine is built on the assumption that tanks are proof against small arms, and questioning that assumption requires questioning decades of procurement, training, and tactical development. Congressional oversight would demand answers about why existing vehicles don't protect against this threat. Defense contractors would face liability questions about whether their armor performs as specified. It's a bureaucratic nightmare that no one wants to trigger. Reason 3, and this is the most troubling. Maybe they're quietly aware of the problem but have calculated that it's acceptable risk. Maybe military planners have run the scenarios and determined that the tactical situations where a 20mm rifle could effectively engage armor are rare enough that it does unjustify the cost of addressing the vulnerability. Maybe they're right, but if they're making that calculation, it should be done transparently with congressional oversight. Let us talk about solutions, because I do want this to be just problem identification without addressing how you fix it if you took the vulnerability seriously. The M1 Abrams weighs 73 tons in its latest configuration. Adding significant side armor could push it over 80 tons, which creates mobility and logistics problems that might be worse than the vulnerability you're trying to fix. The solution to reactive or active protection on the sides. Modern active protection systems like Trophy can intercept incoming projectiles before they hit the armor, but these systems are optimized for detecting and defeating missiles and rocket-propelled grenades, which are slower than rifle rounds. At 20mm, a PDS penetrator traveling at 1,000 meters per second gives the active protection system milliseconds to detect, classify, and engage. It's unclear whether current systems can reliably defeat these threats. Reactive armor might work, but adds weight and has its own vulnerabilities, as we discussed in the previous video about cumulative thermal stress. Solution 3. Doctrine and tactics. Do UN put your tanks in positions where they can be engaged from? Prepared positions by weapons with clear sight lines to the side armor. This is actually the most practical solution, but it limits the tactical flexibility of armored forces and essentially concedes that tanks can't operate in certain environments without unacceptable risk. That's a hard thing for an institution to admit when its entire identity is built around combined arms maneuver warfare. Solution 4. And this is the one I think makes the most sense but is also the hardest to implement. Radical transparency about armor capabilities and vulnerabilities. Tell tank crews exactly what threats their armor can and cannot stop. Train them to recognize tactical situations where they're vulnerable. Develop tactics that account for the reality that armor has limits. This requires cultural change in military institutions that have traditionally emphasized the invincibility of their equipment to maintain morale and confidence. Here's my conclusion, and I want to be very precise about what I'm claiming. The NTW-20 test at Aberdeen Proving Ground demonstrated that, under specific conditions, a man-portable rifle can defeat armor that it theoretically shouldn't be able to penetrate. This isn't because the armor was defective. It's because armor performance in the real world is more complex than the mathematical models predict, and because small, high-velocity penetrators exploit vulnerabilities that larger weapons don't. Whether this represents a systematic threat or a statistical anomaly is unknown, because the follow-up testing that would answer that question has either never been conducted or remains classified. The institutional response has been to minimize and ignore rather than investigate and adapt. And that response, more than the test result itself, is what should concern anyone who cares about whether our military equipment actually does what we read told it does. Physics didn't fail at Aberdeen. It worked exactly as physics always does. What almost failed was our understanding of physics, and what definitely failed was our willingness to confront uncomfortable data that threatens. Establish doctrine and procurement programs. The strongest rifle ever tested against a tank revealed something more important than its own capabilities. It revealed how fragile our confidence in armor really is when that confidence is actually tested.